today we're here to discuss a topic that I've been meaning to cover for a while, and I was sort of hoping I wouldn't have to do it, but we do need to do it, and so here we are to discuss spanking. So I'd like to address two things before we get started. The first is that I have never spanked my daughter, and I never plan to spank her, and I don't advocate that any parent I work with spank their children either. I'm going to probe the literature and ask some pretty pointed questions of my guest, and if they were taken out of context, you might think that I'm arguing in favor of spanking. And I want to be clear that I'm not, but I do want us to understand the research base as well as we can. And so the second thing is that if you're here because you're spanking your child now, or you've done it in the past and you're wondering to what extent it might have done damage to them, or you see how close you've come to spanking them and you're worried about what impact it might do if it were to ever happen, then I want you to know that you're not alone. If you're this close to spanking your child, or even if spanking is not your kind of response, but you yell or walk away or completely freeze or try to placate them to get them to stop crying, then that's because you're having a triggered reaction. It might seem like the thing that needs to change here is your child's behavior, because then you wouldn't need to have these massive reactions. But actually, these reactions come from trauma that you've experienced in your childhood or that you're experiencing now due to, I don't know, something like the stress from a global pandemic. If you want to learn more about the real causes of your triggered feelings, I invite you to join a free masterclass that I'm going to host next Saturday, February 12th from 10 to 11:30 a.m. Pacific, called How to Tame Your Triggers Around Your Child's Difficult Behavior Without Having to Stuff Your Feelings Down and Pretend You're Not Angry. I know it's a long title, but as we say in England, it does exactly what it says in the tin. You'll learn all about the 5 categories of reasons why you feel triggered and how to navigate those situations more effectively without reciting a script or having to grit your teeth and tell your child, "I'm not angry," when you're really seething, and how to repair your relationship with your child on the fewer occasions when it does still happen. It's totally free, and you can sign up at yourparentingmojo.com/triggers masterclass. We'll have plenty of time for a Q&A and live coaching of one lucky parent on the call and a giveaway as well. So do sign up even if you know you can't attend, and I'll send you the replay afterwards. But of course, you do have to be there live to submit questions and maybe get coaching and to win the giveaway. So now let's turn to our episode today on spanking. My guest for this conversation is Professor Andrew Grogan-Kaylor, Professor of Social Work at the University of Michigan. Professor Grogan-Kaylor's research focuses on scientific knowledge development and intervention research on children and families with the aim of reducing violence against children and improving family and child well-being. His current research projects examine parenting behaviors like physical punishment and parental expressions of emotional warmth and support, and their effects on children's aggression, antisocial behavior, and depression. He also examines the interplay of parenting behaviors and their effects on child health and mental health outcomes across socioeconomic contexts, neighborhoods, and cultures. He's co-author with Dr. Elizabeth Gershoff of a seminal 2016 meta-analysis on spanking, and his paper on the case for the designation of spanking as an adverse childhood experience was selected as 2017 Article of the Year in the journal Child Abuse and Neglect. Welcome, Professor Grogan-Kaylor.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
If you wouldn't mind first defining what is spanking for us, and then we can sort of get into things like how prevalent it is, who spanks, and who gets spanked.
Okay, well, so in that spirit, I suppose we're going to dive, and in the interest of open science, I suppose we're going to dive right into the limitations of the research in my answer to the first question.
An excellent place to start.
Which is, we define spanking, or we think what we're talking about is, applying a hand to a child's bottom to discipline them, to correct their action, hopefully not in an abusive way, but in a way that causes them to be startled, or those who spank some mild amount of pain. The reason I sort of always pause there is because we don't give that verbose of a definition to people when we ask them. Most of the interviews that we do, we're trying to establish a rapport. We're trying to start a conversation about, what is your family life like, and that kind of definition, kind of rigid definition that we probably all carry around in our heads would be off-putting. So we generally say, how often have you spanked your child in the past week? How often have you spanked your child in the past month? How often have you done that in the past year? In the spirit of full transparency about limitations of what we do, that might be one of them.
Yeah. Okay. And so for our purposes today, what we are talking about is a hand to the buttocks in general. But yeah, absolutely, the point that this is a limitation that we find it even hard to ask people because it's so socially unacceptable, and yet so many people do it. I was stunned by the prevalence rate.
Right. We talked about some of the things we might talk about beforehand, and I was thinking, well, what do I know about the prevalence? And you look in the U.S. or you look internationally. We've been doing some work with international data, sort of the 3, 4, and 5-year-olds that we think of as the most likely to be exposed to spanking. That's about a third. A third of parents are using it fairly consistently.
Ah, okay. So I had seen Dr. Gershoff's paper finding a prevalence rate of 80%. I'm curious about that discrepancy. Where do you think that comes from? Is that a discrepancy in
It,
the
it, it,
definition
it,
again?
it, it, it hops around a lot from study to study. I would also wonder if when you talk about lifetime prevalence, has this ever happened to you? You ask people retrospectively, did they ever experience it as a child, or parents, did you ever use this with your child? Then the rates are usually around 80%.
Okay.
But when you say, is this something, kind of trying to get a snapshot, is this something you're doing regularly right now? It's usually around a third, but sometimes it's around 50% in some groups of people.
Okay. And the advocates of spanking, and there are advocates of spanking,
Mhm. Certainly.
will say that this should usually be done between the ages of 2 and 12. And I'm guessing that that's because you're assuming that on the lower end the child doesn't understand well enough what they did wrong to for the spank to be able to have any impact, and on the higher end the child's probably going to start hitting you back, I would think, at some point.
Well,
Is that,
I think 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, when I hear people advocating, so to speak, those are the ages that they're talking about. Nobody advocates spanking infants, but actually Professor Shauna Lee, one of my colleagues here at the University of Michigan, she and I worked on a study, and about a third of parents were reporting that they spanked their 1-year-old child. So in my mind, even if you're an advocate of the practice, well below the age where there'd be any comprehension. And then, I think the reason it tapers off is there's some rough sense that it becomes, for those who think that it's in any way appropriate, it becomes much less appropriate when you're talking about a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old.
okay.
Maybe not the hit back, but just that it, somehow kind of not a thing, almost. Kind of not a thing we would do.
Okay. All right. And of course it's interesting as to why we suddenly shift our perspective at around that age. And I don't want to spend too much time on schools. We're going to spend mostly our time focused on what parents do and what happens in the home. But 19 states actually do permit corporal punishment in schools as well.
Yeah, and yeah, and it's my colleague Elizabeth Gershoff, you mentioned, is kind of the real expert on what's going on in the legislation. But anything I've seen about the evidence base, it's no better, or it's as bad if it's done in school, if it's done in the family. Yeah, that well, I'll save all the research comments for later, but yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about the effectiveness of spanking. And we're going to hear this name mentioned a lot. There's a researcher named Dr. Lars Lear, and we were just chatting beforehand that neither of us are completely certain as to if that pronunciation is correct, but I think it's pretty close. And so I think it's fair to him to say that he is an advocate for spanking as a tool for parents, and that we shouldn't tell parents not to spank because we don't have evidence-based tools to replace it with. And he argues that the reason we shouldn't do that is because it is effective at changing children's behavior. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that based on the research that you have seen and done yourself as well.
Yeah, the thing I would think about is Professor Gershoff and I working on this review of 50 years of research literature on spanking, physical punishment, whatever you would want to call it. And we went in thinking, there's a tremendous amount of controversy about this. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of controversy in my classrooms. Sometimes I will, you try to establish some kind of human connection as a professor standing in front of the room and say, this is what I'm working on, or this is what I'm concerned about. And it's an interesting area to work in, because people in my classrooms will tell me, well, you're wrong. That's just not the case, that spanking is bad. I mean, that has declined over time. So, we perceived that there was a tremendous amount of cultural controversy or cultural discussion, and we thought, well, let's take this renewed look at the research base. Liz had done an earlier review, and let's see what the research has to say. And there's just no controversy, statistically or in evidential terms. There's just no controversy. So, when that piece came out, people would say, "Is there anything surprising?" And it's I thought, I don't know, I'd be weighing opposite cases against each other, and there's just no controversy. There's kind of a unanimous signal out of the research. So it's very hard for me, and admittedly, I have a point of view, but it's very hard for me to see what is the benefit. And I see so many of the harms.
Okay. And so I'm guessing there's sort of a short-term issue and a long-term issue here, right? Does the child's behavior change immediately with the specific issue that you're talking about, and also with in the longer term? Is the child exhibiting what researchers tend to call externalizing behavior, which is what we essentially think of as acting out? And so I'm trying to understand how he can get to a conclusion where he sees that it is effective in the short term. I'm not sure that he's looking so much at the long term.
Well, I think what Professor Larzalera has done, as I understand his published work, has often been to argue that we're overreaching, and that we're and I've probed through the articles, and it may be my own brain limitation here, but I probed and and if spanking's bad, so is therapy. Is something that any kind of corrective action inevitably leads to bad outcomes, and so I think it's so there's a two-part answer here. I think that the first part is that he thinks we're overreaching and that we're not controlling enough, particularly for the child's earlier bad behavior. So the bad associations that we find are what we'd call statistical artifacts. I mean, they're mistakes. They're mistakes on our part. I'm not sure that I am sure that I disagree with his reasoning. And then I think, the pivot from there seems to be that this is then okay. And what some of my colleagues have said is, show me the large study with thousands of families and children, where the families that employ spanking the children are so much better off. And the families that refrain from spanking are so much worse off. And as I just said, that's never the case. Hundreds of studies, hundreds of thousands of children, it's just never the case. So until I can be shown, I don't know, if we did a study of exercise, we'd find that everybody who got out and exercised felt better, was in a better mood, and their hearts and lungs were healthier. Show me that kind of thing, that people who spank, families who spank, have better outcomes, and I'll consider that. But sort of chipping away at this or that, I'm less convinced.
Okay. And just to go a little bit deeper into your first point, I think that this is something that he does come back to repeatedly, which is teasing out cause and effect. And how can we know whether spanking causes children to be more aggressive, or whether it's just more aggressive children get spanked more? How do we work on understanding that?
Say that again, just so I have a lot of opinions about this, and I'm going to answer something that you didn't ask yet. So.
Trying to understand which is the chicken and which is the egg. So is it that the spanking comes first and that causes more aggression, or is it that the child is more aggressive and so they get spanked more, and then there is potentially some outcome at the other end that is also more aggression, but there was more aggression at the baseline, and that's what the difference really is between two groups of children?
Sure. So, I mean, I suppose we have an hour, and your questions did look pretty detailed, and it sounds like this is a science-minded podcast. So, forgive me a little bit of science here. I mean, we think about maybe three things. We think, did the thing we think is the cause, did it come before the effect? Yeah. I mean, I walked over to the light switch and flipped it up, and then the light came on. I mean, the light didn't come on, and then I walked over, that sort of thing. And we think, is there a relationship? As I flip the switch, the light is going on and off. That's the second thing. And then we think, is there some, the third and last thing is, do we think there's some plausible alternative explanation? There's something going on in the world. It's not that Andy is flipping the light switch. There's some other dynamic out there that is making, and probably if I had time and energy enough, I could imagine some kind of thing that might be going on sometimes, but most of the time it's the light switch that's flipping the light on and off. So we've done the same thing with spanking, trying not just, are they related? Are they correlated? Everybody says correlation is not causation, but correlation is sometimes causation. So we've tried to look very carefully in the interviews and the databases we have. Is the spanking coming before the bad outcomes? Well, yeah, that seems to be going on. Are they related? Most of the time, nobody disputes that. People say it's correlation. It's not causation. We think it's causation. And then really the kicker, can we rule out other things that are kind of common cause, or other things that might be going on, that it might be, I don't know, there might be, income is sometimes a driver of these things. So maybe it's just that people with not a lot of economic resources, they spank their kids, and their kids have behavior problems down the road. Or maybe it's something more internal to the house. It's something about the emotional climate, that it's not the spanking per se, it's the tone or the affect with which it's delivered. And any investigation that we have been able to carry out, the spanking comes before the bad outcome. They are related, and we can find no other thing that fully accounts for that relationship that we see. Okay. In fact, other things are usually pretty poor at explaining it away, and that relationship persists statistically.
Okay, great. And so I think that sort of leads us nicely into some of the things that Dr. Lazalier has said about the positive parenting, which I know you have written about as an alternative to spanking. And you've sort of touched on a few of these sort of 4 methodological fallacies that he says are present in the research on positive parenting. Firstly, basing causal conclusions on correlations, which you just touched on a little bit. And secondly, ignoring causal evidence from randomized trials. Thirdly, extrapolating from low usage of spanking to zero usage of spanking. And then fourthly, failing to discriminate how consequences are used and in the situations that they're used. And so I think you've helped us to understand the sort of causal correlation issue. And another way that I saw in the literature that you were trying to understand this was matching of participants in these studies. So you would match them. Sometimes studies would do it across like 26, 30 something variables, and say, okay, these children are alike in all of these ways, and the main difference between them is whether or not they're spanked. And those studies have fairly consistent, there haven't been that many of them, but fairly consistently found that that children who have never been spanked are having significantly fewer externalizing behavior issues than children who have been spanked. So is that an important way that we can try and understand the difference between the two? That doesn't rely on us having to have causal evidence where, one child is randomly assigned to be spanked and the other child is randomly assigned to not be spanked.
Right. So we we take our critics seriously, and exactly as you've mentioned, my friend and colleague Jorge Cuartas over at Harvard, he and I and a bunch of other folks worked on a study where we did exactly that. You're trying to match children, I don't know, 25, 26, 30 variables to make sure that they're otherwise alike. Maybe that's another way of saying it. You're trying to rule out the alternative. There's not something else going on. There's not some other difference. So lo and behold, we found that amongst otherwise similar children, the spanking made a difference. Sometimes we sort of try to, is it really the aggression that's causing the spanking, or is it the spanking that's causing the aggression? We try to kind of model those dynamic processes a little more explicitly. Um, we're never able to find, we throw our statistical scrutiny at the evidence, and it doesn't go away. I do think this evidence is causal. I mean, we know that well, it's not perfect, but the gold standard scientific evidence for causality is a randomized controlled trial. It just is. And if you're testing an intervention, I'm working on a mental health intervention right now to help people with a mental health issue, and you assign the usual treatment, and then some people randomly get the better treatment, and you can do that because you're not withholding something or hurting people. But in so many of the things we study, we're ethically unable to do that. You cannot randomly assign children to be hit. You cannot randomly assign them to be deprived. And then people sort of collapse into this nostrum of, well, correlation is not causation, ignoring. We did the same with smoking and lung cancer. We didn't randomly make some people smoke and check in with them several decades later with other things. And I'm going to cut myself off because I'm going to get on a tirade here, but asbestos and lung disease, lead paint, and cognitive cognitive delays in children. We know we can't randomly assign. We still think we can find some measure of causal, and I'm going to say causal loud and clear. We still think we can find some approximation of causality and make public policy decisions to help people. So excuse the tirade, but I do wonder why we have such difficulty in doing the very same thing in protecting children.
Yeah, as we do in other aspects of health, and to sort of go into it a little bit further, this randomized controlled trial, Dr. Lazalier sort of has a quirk of time on his side. From what I've read in the research, there was this period in the 80s where the ethics controls were not quite as strict as they are now, and there was a Dr. Roberts working at the University of Idaho who actually did randomly assign children to be in a condition where they were or weren't spanked in a certain laboratory situation. And so he points to this evidence, which, I mean, these are tiny trials. These are eight children in each condition. And in a highly simulated environment where he's basically saying, well, you have to have access to a 4-foot by 5-foot room with a certain high sheet of plywood. And if you have that, then you're in this condition. And if parents don't have that at home, then, you better spank because clearly you don't have the conditions in place. So he has this randomized controlled trial, which I'm putting in air quotes for those of you not watching on YouTube, in support of, again, air quotes, spanking, which to me, it doesn't seem as though it cuts the mustard, even though when we hear randomized controlled trial, we're like, oh yeah, that's the gold standard.
Yeah. So, and again, this may be my own cognitive limitations. I've read those studies many, many times, and for me, they are very difficult to understand. So these few tiny early studies, it's just difficult to understand. And in some of our earlier conversations, you and I have noted that, Professor Gershoff came to one conclusion about what those very, very small studies, 8 children, said. And then she and I looked at them about a decade later, and well, it looks like, Professor Roberts was doing this, and we actually think, we might have made a mistake, and actually this is how to calculate the numbers. So they're very, very, very difficult. They're very, very small and very, very difficult. But then the other point is they are very, very, very small. And I imagine, um, there might be a study of 8 smokers out there, who all did just fine. Um, and it took me probably about 20 years, at least 15 years. I believe I really do. I believe in randomized clinical trials, and I believe that we're always trying to approximate them as best we can. Um, but the other side of the coin is, how many people are we talking about? And a small study can be a very noisy study. So yeah, there's probably 8 people exposed to asbestos who just, went on to live lovely lives. And I wouldn't base public health decisions on that.
Okay, thank you for those analogies. What about the case that there's an optimal level of spanking somewhere above 0 that results in maximum compliance? And I think separately we'll address the issue that compliance is our goal here. Do you think that there is a sort of a level at which spanking is not harmful and actually does help to change children's behavior?
No. And maybe I'm going to jump off the research for a minute. Been talking to some of my clinical social work colleagues about this, and sort of, what do they see clinically, think theoretically. And if you think about it, it's so disruptive. If you think about this in terms of attachment theory, this is the person, where I'm supposed to be grounded and I'm supposed to be supported at the time of my life, infancy, and young childhood, where I'm most vulnerable. And this person, sometimes loves me, or loves me most of the time, but every now and then just hits me. And conversations with more clinically minded colleagues, they have convinced me, sort of thinking in these attachment terms, what could be more disruptive and dysregulating. I think the evidence base isn't as good as it could be, but I apologize for shouting out to all my colleagues, but this has been such a collaborative endeavor. If I was just a talking head, I'd be misrepresenting. So I'm thinking of Julie Ma at the University of Michigan Flint, who did a study with children in Chile. And she looked very carefully at that particular question. No truth to it. I mean, there's almost a stair step of effect that, at the one spanking a week is as bad as, or the is bad, and the 5 spankings a week are 5 times as bad. But it's not like the one spanking a week is somehow normative or okay.
Right. Okay. And then that sort of leads me into, well, what about defiant children? Children who just are not complying. And Dr. Lazalier says, and I quote, "Parents should choose from the mildest disciplinary tactics that will be effective in any disciplinary situation, but defiant children need stronger tactics to enforce milder tactics to achieve that goal." And so what I think he usually advocates for is timeout. And then when the child won't stay in timeout, that the parent should then spank. So is there a point at which timeout is not a useful tool with a child anymore? And I have opinions on timeout that we'll get to hopefully if we have time.
Sure.
And spanking is needed in some way if compliance is the thing you're going for.
No. I'm thinking, having a defiant child, that's difficult. And I mean, it's so wearing. And I think people are looking for solutions. And again, I've got clinical social work colleagues who, would be so much better at telling you about, taking away privileges in a structured and developmentally appropriate way. I mean, that's usually the sort of thing they talk about. And it's arduous. There is no magic solution. And given that there's no magic solution, spanking is certainly not the magic solution.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, so that's an interesting way of putting it. We're almost looking for a magic solution to ensure compliance, if compliance is what we're going for. And there is no single magic solution. And if you're choosing between non-magic solutions, there's a non-magic solution that hurts your child is probably not the one to go with. Is that an accurate sort of
Yeah, and
encapsulation?
there's probably some evidence that for the more disruptive or more aggressive child, um, it's actually worse, almost fuel on the fire.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you know, my heart goes out to people, but there's no magic, and it's kind of the long-term patient investments, and that's what the research would say, and that's what my clinical colleagues would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. All right. And so I want to come back to something we've touched on a few times, but to be super crystal clear on it, whether spanking is harmful to children. And I think that that your meta-analysis was criticized in some quarters for not separating children who have been spanked with things, being hit with an object,
Mm-hmm.
hitting the face instead of the sort of hand to the buttocks that we talked about when we came in. And several of the studies rely on recalls an adult being spanked and sort of confounding with physical abuse. How can we understand the totality of the picture about whether spanking is harmful to children?
Two ways, probably. I'm going to go back to the meta-analysis. Elizabeth Gershoff and I, we worked so hard to parse out, the abusive spanking and the hitting with objects and the beating with objects, or the word beating itself. So we worked so hard, read each of those articles, it feels like 20 times, making sure that we're excluding the spanking that is not what we think of as the customary or the normative spanking. So we think, we wrote the article, but we think that we did a pretty good job of talking about normal or usual spanking, and we cut out all of that other stuff, and we find a lot of harm. I mean, we find however many outcomes, the mental health problems, the behavior problems, all of those sorts of things. So that's part of it. And then I would go back to my earlier point of, I challenge someone else to do the large sample study with a careful definition of normative spanking and find, hey, it's okay. Actually, when we hit kids in young childhood, they all do better in school, or they all go to college and graduate with all A's. I just don't think that study is out there. And in the 15 years I've been working on it, people will sort of chip away at our conclusions, which is fine. Scientific debate is fine, but show me the study where this is such a good thing. Show me the study where this is so helpful to children.
Okay. And so you've actually made the case then, as we mentioned in the introduction, that spanking in childhood should be considered an adverse childhood experience.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us how you came to that conclusion?
I think it's interesting to me. I got interested in this about 15 years ago, and I thought, this is an interesting new research direction. And I had a really good idea for a paper, and I thought, I'll write a paper on this, and then I'll move on.
Well, that went well, didn't it?
Yeah, that went so well. I'm very interested in parenting and child development, but this spanking paper that I'm writing is a one-off. And 15 years later, there still seems to be quite a bit of debate. And as we've been part of this debate and this conversation, I think, a number of people are recognizing there are things that we clearly think of as adverse childhood experiences, like abuse, or like having a parent who's experiencing mental illness, or a parent who's incarcerated. Those are hard things to go through as a child. And then you look at the long-term outcomes of those things. Lo and behold, the long-term outcomes of spanking are pretty much in the same ballpark. So given that there's this consistent, ongoing, growing evidence base of how bad it is, it's interesting how long these things take, but It's almost as if we collectively are suddenly realizing, like, wow, we have this list of adverse childhood experiences. Maybe we should add spanking to the list. I think we should add spanking to the list.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one thing that I was interested in diving into the literature on was the case of how do you separate abuse from spanking. And you had sent me a paper actually written in Canada about the legality of spanking there. And there were a number of conditions that the Canadian Supreme Court had sort of defined as abuse. One of them is, or actually it was the other way around. It was saying that is not abuse if, and there's like 4 things before this, is it corrective that is not the result of the caregiver's frustration, loss of temper, or abusive personality. And I'm thinking, well, what parent doesn't spank their child when they're not frustrated? I mean, the whole reason you perceive that there is a need to spank is because you're frustrated by your child's inability to adhere to some behavior that you think they should be able to do. And so to me, it's like that it's almost like there is no spanking that isn't abusive based on that definition, because inherently we are doing it because we're frustrated if we're spanking.
Yeah, I'm going off of the research and just conversations I have with people, because a lot of people end up talking to me about these issues, and that is a common thread in conversations I have. I don't think the research does a very good job of measuring parental anger. I'm not actually sure that that's going to be the most fruitful or helpful direction. But anyway, we don't do the greatest job there. But when people talk to me, they will say my parents were angry and they hit me or spanked me, or my parents would get more and more angry, and then they would hit me or spank me. So a couple hundred anecdotes would lead me to suspect that that's pretty common.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one of the things that there were many things that I found shocking in this research. One of the things I was most shocked to find was Dr. Diana Baumrein has been so active in this field, and not in the way we might expect. So you had already mentioned attachment and the links to attachment. And for those of you who are thinking Baumrein, where have I heard that before? It's the parenting styles: authoritative, authoritarian, permissive.
Mm-hmm.
And so she has worked with Dr. Lazalier consistently on studies related to this topic. And I want to quote from one of their studies: since only a small proportion of the large majority of parents who spank their children ever abuse them, and the most successful parents, meaning authoritative parents, are average in their use of spanking, it is illogical to presume that abusive corporal punishment can be discouraged only by completely enjoining all spanking. To date, there has been no convincing evidence that spanking bans reduce child physical abuse. And I don't even know what to make of that. It almost seems as though, she's created this category and called these people successful parents, and they happen to spank, and therefore spanking is not harmful to children, seems to be the argument. How would you respond to that?
Well, I would think, as a simple, straightforward person as I am, looking at the research base, we can talk about the parenting styles in just a second, but quite apart from parenting styles, how does this thing called spanking, wow, if you do this thing called spanking, how's that going to work out for you? And nothing's deterministic in child development, but your child is more likely to be depressed. Your child is more likely to be anxious. There's some evidence of more likely to use substances, less likely to do well in school. So, I do think it, I certainly think we should classify it as an adverse childhood experience. I'm not really sure where I'm going to come down on is it abuse, but is it a thing you want to do? Is it a thing you want to encourage? If you're in the position of advising other parents or giving advice to families, do you want to be telling them that this is okay? There's no evidence, and in fact, there's so much evidence that this is a wrong thing to do, It's just out and out puzzling. I will say about the parenting styles, that was important and seminal work for its time. But if you think, there's sort of her parenting styles are you high or low in control, kind of cross-referenced with are you high or low in involvement. I think those are the dimensions, and it kind of makes
Warmth
this
and
little
demandingness, I think you're having.
warmth and
Yeah.
demandingness. Yeah, it makes this little 2x2 table that you cross-reference, and everybody fits in a little box. And the more I've thought about it, I think that it is just not a complicated enough metaphor for parenting, for something as complex and multidimensional as parenting. Everybody fits in a little 2x2 box. And I've always thought, well, where do you put spanking? And in her conceptualization, spanking is part of this authoritative, that you are warm, but you are also demanding, and you are also imposing some control. And I think this is a case where the theory just distorts reality. I've started to think, do you remember equalizers on a stereo? Do you?
Vaguely.
Okay. maybe I had too many stereos when I was young, or I was too old. I'm so old that I had so many stereos. But I think of all these little knobs. I can turn up the bass, or I can turn up the subwoofer. I can turn up the mid range. I can turn up the treble. And if you open up iTunes, you have a little equalizer where you can adjust all the different levels to make your different sorts of music sound optimal. And I think that idea, I need to work on the metaphor, obviously, but that idea of there being a multiplicity of levers is so much more attuned to the reality and complexity of parenting, and that everybody fits in one of these 2x2 boxes. It seems overly simple for what we know about parenting. So then you think about, you've got these multiplicity of levers. Well, one of those levers that you would want to turn way down is harsh physical punishment. That's something you'd want to make sure you never do, pretty much.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I appreciate the metaphor, and I have a feeling there's an episode coming on on the parenting styles. So okay, so let's talk about banning spanking, the legality of spanking, and children are the only group of American citizens who can be legally subjected to physical punishment. But when adults are surveyed about whether they think that's okay, a majority of them will usually say that's okay. And it seems as though it's sort of linked to not wanting the government to have any say over how parents run their families. And so I want to dive into this a little bit and figure out, should spanking be banned? And not just from a, well, it's bad and so it should be banned, but what would it actually mean, and what could be some potential unintended consequences from that? And I have a couple ideas that I'd like to run by you as well.
Okay.
So firstly, should it be banned?
Yeah, I think there's evidence that this is something harmful, and yeah, I would come down on the side of a ban, definitely. Something we haven't touched on yet is that when you think about a global conversation about parenting and child development, I believe it's 62 countries at this point around the world have implemented country level bans on the use of physical punishment. So I often think this is an area, perhaps there are others, where we in the United States are a little out of step with what the rest of the globe thinks. And so when you pay attention to a global conversation, an international conversation, particularly as it's, sort of run through the United Nations and UNICEF, countries are banning spanking. We are behind the times. And I'm not sure if we wanted to get into this territory yet, but there is the convention, United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which early on did not, talked about protecting children from violence in general, and didn't quite clarify that they were indeed talking about physical punishment as well. Later on, they clarified that. But we are the only the United States is the only non-signatory to the Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Oh, I thought it was us and Sudan. Is Sudan signed now?
Well, we are the only non-signatory that at the time the treaty was originally being signed had a standing government capable of ratifying treaties. So Sudan gets a little bit of a waiver because during that time period,
they had other stuff going on.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So so that there is a broad movement further afield. And Dr. Lazalier and Dr. Baumrind argue that 30 years after Sweden passed its first spanking ban, there's little evidence that parents use more effective and less aversive disciplinary tactics. Apparently, they're more likely to use physical restraint and what they call coercive verbal control. Another study from Quebec, which I assume is banned spanking as well, reported increased psychological aggression, yelling, screaming, cursing, calling the child stupid, that kind of thing. So when we think about potential unintended consequences, we might be able to say, I can conceptually easily say, yes, I think spanking should be banned. But what happens after that when it comes to what options parents have if they don't feel as though they have other options that are necessarily less harmful for the child?
I think you need to, I think you always need to pair it with what are the other options, because, it took me a long time of talking about this to realize it's not just okay, or it's not sufficient for me as a researcher to say, these are the negatives, these are the things you shouldn't do. So I think, at a treatment level, at a family services level, at a country level, if we're thinking about banning spanking, that has to be paired with, well, these are good ways to deal with your child, because children will sometimes do things that adults do not wish them to do. Children will, that's just reality. And we're not pretending that that's not going to happen. We're trying to find optimal ways to enhance child development. So you've got to talk about, the structured and developmentally appropriate taking away of privileges. You've got to talk about having the conversations. You've got to talk about, well, what's it like to listen to your kid? What does that mean to try to get inside your kid's head? Because I think for so many of us that that what was not presented to us as part of our toolkit, and those are skills we have to learn.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I would like to advocate for bans on spanking coming out of the evidence base, but at the same time, I think that has to be paired with what do you do, and then. Sorry, there's one more piece, which is, you got to think that people are caught in difficult circumstances,
Mm-hmm.
right? Not everybody has a secure job or a secure home or feels secure in their own life. So there's all kinds of macro level thinking that we have to do about, how can we give people the opportunity to take the time, or how can we make sure that they have the space in their work lives so they can stop and pause and listen to what their kids are doing. There are a lot of dimensions to this. So yes, bans, but bans and a lot of support and a lot of resources.
Yeah, I was just thinking yes, and as you were saying it, and I really appreciate you bringing up some of the structural issues, and I think that there is a lot of that at play when we think about issues like poverty and structural racism that have people feeling as though they're at the end of their rope. Even patriarchy, that where we think about we're not trained culturally to share what we're thinking, to even what we're feeling, to even understand fully ourselves what we're feeling. Never mind share that with somebody else. Never mind ask a child who's in a traditionally hierarchically subservient position to us. How are you feeling about this? So I think that I agree with you. I think there's a lot of that at play. And one of my other concerns about potentially banning spanking was, there are some families that are more likely than other families to have child protective services called. And so I'm thinking, okay, well, what if we ban spanking with the best of intentions to protect children's health and well-being, and a Black family who maybe somebody sees them spanking their child, they're more likely to have child protective services called. Child protective services is more likely to respond to that call in a certain way. and that we may end up with an even more detrimental effect of, potentially family separation. We're talking about once Child Protective Services gets involved, in communities that have already been so disrupted by structural racism. Where does that fit in our, idealistic, yes, we think spanking should be banned view?
Maybe it's another yes and. Absolutely, we clearly have a pandemic of racism in this country, and we clearly have miles to go on that issue. We've clearly got things to work on, but there are still children in Black families and white families that. Well, I think the other thing to remember is that, so when CPS is called, that actually so infrequently results in removal from the home. I mean, we have this idea that is always going on, and that's actually sort of a last resort outcome. So I think we can do both. I think we can have both goals dear to our heart. We want to eliminate racism, and we want to protect children. I just don't see those in contradiction.
Okay. Are there differences that you see between how people in countries outside the US and maybe people of different racial backgrounds and how they view spanking?
Yeah, it's. I think there are differences, within the U.S. and around the globe. I was trying to think just this morning, because I knew we were going to talk about this issue. Well, what's the driver here? And I think actually the driver, everything is obvious once you know the answer. But the driver is, if something in your culture tells you it's okay. If it's a thing that other people do all the time, it's the biggest thing that I can see. We've just finished a study where we're trying to look at sort of who spanks actually. Is it demographic characteristics, or is it material resources? Everybody knows this answer already when we tell them, even though they didn't do the study. We did the study, but everybody says we already knew that. But the biggest predictor is this kind of a thing that goes on in your group a lot? I mean, your group or your culture or your country, and so that seems to be kind of the biggest predictor. I guess the other thing I wanted to say is, that lends rise to this question of, if it's more common, doesn't that mean it's more okay? Children don't perceive it as so abnormal or as out of line, and that's something where my colleagues and I have done a lot of work, and there just doesn't seem to be any evidence of that. This is a country where there's a lot of physical punishment. Physical punishment seems to be bad. This is a country where there's not a lot. Physical punishment seems to be bad. That kind of contextual thing makes a lot of difference to how many people spank, but not how bad it is.
Okay, so just to clarify and be super clear about what you're saying that even if it's more common in some countries and others, among some groups of people than others, that doesn't mean there's a difference in how it impacts the children. It's still harmful to the child, no matter how common it is in that culture or what that culture's view of spanking is. Is that right?
Yeah, and we'll look at this sort of country by country or neighborhood by neighborhood, and there. Yeah, kind of people, we tend to do what we see modeled around us, but that doesn't mean that our children are going to be any better or any worse off. Spanking is equally as bad, whether you're doing it in a place where it's always done or a place where it's never done.
Okay, great. All right. And then as we wrap up, I want to think about, okay, well, if we're not spanking, what are we doing? And you've mentioned withdrawing privileges a couple times. And I know timeout is also an option that is discussed a lot. And I think my opinion on timeout is that what you're essentially doing when you're telling a child, go in this room, or if you're, in one of the Idaho studies, it's you're going to go in this very small room and I'm going to be outside and you have to stay in there. For a period of time that's often the number of minutes of the child's age. So if the child is 2, they go in for 2 minutes. What the parent is essentially doing is saying, I'm withdrawing my love from you, my approval of you, my affection for you for this period of time until your behavior complies with my wishes, with my demands. And nowhere in this do I ever see the idea that, well, perhaps the parent's wish or demand is not appropriate. It's not age appropriate. Or maybe it's something that came down to us from our parents, and there's really no real reason we do it. It's more of a habit than anything else. And we don't ever consider the idea that, well, maybe the child might actually have an idea about how to do this thing that's worth considering. So is timeout and withdrawal of punishment, do you think, a good alternative to spanking? Or should we be looking beyond those tools to figure out how to work with our children in a way that enables them to see our perspective and we see their perspective? So we can actually work together on finding a solution that works for both of us.
So Andy, the researcher, thinks that the research base on timeout is pretty conflicted. Andy, the person who thinks about what Andy, the researcher, does, sort of sits back and thinks, I'm starting to think that sometimes the best we can do in a disciplinary situation is not screw it up too badly. And timeout, there are, to me, just kind of personally very disturbing elements. I'm withholding my attention, I'm withholding my love, I'm withholding my affection. I mentioned that I wrote this one paper and I thought I would be done with this topic 15 years ago. And here I am making this massive slow pivot that I'm boring all my research colleagues with it. Like, I'm switching direction. But I am really trying to, I think, I do think that the case that spanking is an adverse childhood experience, I think we're kind of done with that. I think the evidence is in that one's kind of done. Yep. And so what would I like to do? Well, for the next 15 years, I'd like to think about positive, happy things. And I would like to put an evidence base under them. And I don't think we've quite done that, but I've been looking, reading my own papers, like, oh yeah, we thought about that and we wrote about that. And I see this suggestion, it's more than a suggestion. I mean, and it's not just me, it's other people as well, that, it's these long-term investments that we make in kids. It's the warmth, it's the emotional support. It's the pretty clearly saying, I love you. It's not just like I'm around and I'm happy and I'm pleasant, but like clearly directively saying to children, I love you, I value you. You're important to me. It's making clear that we enjoy spending time with kids. It's making sure that they know that we will listen to their perspective. We will talk things out with them. We will hear them out. It's all of those things. And I think there are varying degrees of robust evidence underlying some of those things. And maybe, kind of the more positive discipline focused ones, we could do a better job strengthening the research base. So that's kind of the next 15 years. That's
well,
what
now
I'm
really excited.
Yeah, so we could put it on the calendar for
yes.
2036, I guess.
Well, in the meantime, thank you very much for sharing your time with us, for putting 15 years of work into helping us to understand that spanking is not associated with good outcomes for children, and that really the case is fairly clear from what we can tell from what the research says about that. I'm really grateful for you're taking the time to talk with us today and explain that to us.
Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
And don't forget that you can find all of the references for today's episode at yourparentingmojo.com/spanking. And you can also sign up for the free How to Tame Your Triggers Around Your Child's Difficult Behavior Masterclass at yourparentingmojo.com/triggers masterclass. I will look forward to seeing you there.